Look at what the people of Tehran are holding in their hands right now. Not weapons, not protest signs. Empty plastic water containers, being carried through the streets of a capital city of 14 million people by ordinary citizens who have not had water flow from their taps in days. This is Tehran in 2026. A city whose government claimed nuclear power, a regime that spent 4 decades threatening aircraft carriers and promising to set the Middle East ablaze. Right now, in this specific moment, that government is begging its neighbors for water. But what is actually happening inside Iran goes so much deeper than a water shortage, so much deeper than a drought, so much deeper than a military conflict that has now stripped away every layer of concealment from what was dying beneath the surface long before the first bomb was ever dropped. What is collapsing right now in Tehran, in Mashhad, in Isfahan, across a country of 88 million people, is something that no missile strike, no sanction, no naval blockade could have achieved alone. The Iranian regime is being brought to its knees not by the most powerful military in the world. It is being brought to its knees by the complete and total failure of 40 years of its own decisions. And the part that terrifies the regime most, the part that no supreme leader's speech and no IRGC commander's statement can address, is this. There is no enemy to blame for what is actually killing them. No American bomb fell on the dams. No Israeli airstrike destroyed the groundwater. No Western sanction caused the rivers to stop flowing. The regime did this to itself, and the consequences have all arrived at exactly the same moment. Before you can understand what is happening today, you have to go back decades. Because the water crisis strangling Iran right now was not created by this war. The war simply ripped away the last layer of cover hiding what was already dying beneath. For 40 years, Iran has been extracting water from the earth at a rate that defies basic mathematics. Scientists and analysts have documented the arithmetic in painful detail. Iran pulls approximately 8 billion cubic meters of groundwater from the earth every single year. But Iran's geography, its rainfall, its rivers, its snowmelt, can only replenish 45 billion cubic meters annually. That gap of nearly 20 billion cubic meters per year has been quietly draining the country's future for 4 consecutive decades. Aquifers that took thousands of years to form have been emptied within a single human generation. The engineers who built the system that destroyed those aquifers were not rogue actors or incompetent bureaucrats operating at the margins of the regime. They were the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, through its engineering arm, built over 600 dams across Iran in 30 years. Not because the country's hydrologists recommended it, not because environmental impact assessments supported the locations chosen, because each dam was a revenue stream for companies directly affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard's economic network. Most were built in the wrong locations. Many had no genuine environmental assessments. Some were so catastrophically misconceived that they did not store water. They poisoned it. The Gotvan Dam stands as the most devastating single example of this negligence translated into irreversible destruction. Built on the Karun River, directly on top of a massive underground salt dome despite explicit documented warnings from engineers and geologists who understood exactly what would happen when the reservoir filled. When the water rose, it dissolved the salt beneath it. The reservoir's water became saltier than seawater. Hundreds of thousands of acres of fertile agricultural land downstream were irrigated with brine. The soil became barren. Millions of date palms died. One of the most productive agricultural regions in Iran was converted into a wasteland by a dam built to generate profits for the people who were supposed to be protecting the country. Climate scientist Nasser Karami has done the calculation the regime refuses to accept publicly. Iran's geography and water resources can sustainably support a maximum population of 50 million people. Iran's population is approaching 100 million. The regime is trying to keep alive twice the number of people its geography can sustain, using water reserves that have already been depleted beyond any realistic recovery timeline. This is not a drought. A drought ends when rain returns. What Iran is experiencing is water bankruptcy, a permanent structural collapse that no rainfall can reverse because the groundwater that took millennia to accumulate is gone. The savings account is empty, and the regime spent it building dams that generated revenue for the IRGC. Now look at what those numbers mean on the ground in Tehran today. 5 main dams supply the water that flows into the homes, hospitals, and businesses of 14 million people. Before this war began, 4 of those 5 dams were already sitting between 6 and 10% of their capacity. In hydrology, anything below 10% is classified as dead volume. The water at those levels is so contaminated with silt and sediment that purifying it becomes technically and financially unsustainable as a sustainable long-term operation. The Lar Dam was at 1% of capacity before the first airstrike of this conflict. 1%, not because of bombs. Because of decades of over-extraction, mismanagement, and the criminal negligence of a government that was enriching uranium while its capital was running out of water. President Pezeshkian stood before his nation and said something that has no precedent in modern political history. He said that if it does not rain, Tehran would have to begin water rationing. And then he said something even more extraordinary. He suggested the government might need to consider relocating the capital to the southern coast. A sitting head of state publicly contemplating the evacuation of 15 million people because the water has run out. And then the war arrived, and everything standing at the edge of collapse was pushed over it simultaneously. Airstrikes targeted Tehran's power grid. When power fails, water pumps stop, treatment plants go dark, distribution systems freeze. Water outages that were already happening during nighttime hours before the conflict became continuous, round-the-clock events. Southern Tehran's working-class neighborhoods, already the hardest hit by pre-war rationing, are now surviving entirely on water delivered by tanker trucks. And those tankers cannot operate consistently because fuel distribution across a country under naval blockade with a partially destroyed refinery network has become unreliable in ways no emergency measure can quickly fix. Before the war, day zero, the complete cessation of water flowing from taps was described as a coming crisis, something to prepare for, something that might arrive in weeks or months. It has arrived. It is happening now. Mashhad is a separate catastrophe unfolding simultaneously. Iran's second largest city, one of the world's largest Shia pilgrimage destinations. 20 million pilgrims travel to this city every year. Its 4 main dams had dropped below 3% capacity by November 2025. The chairman of the Iranian Parliamentary Water Commission confirmed publicly what satellite imagery had already shown. Mashhad had reached effectively zero. The Taliban, now governing Afghanistan upstream, completed new dam projects that cut the inflow to Mashhad's primary reservoir by 80%. Iran drilled over 400 emergency wells to compensate. The groundwater had already been over-extracted for decades. The wells began running dry almost immediately. 4 million people in Mashhad are now sustaining their daily lives through tanker deliveries and water carried home by hand in containers. And Isfahan, the city that for centuries was called half the world for its architectural magnificence, has watched its defining feature disappear. The Zayanda River, whose name in Persian means life-giving, which flowed for thousands of years beneath the ancient bridges that define the city's identity, has stopped, not been reduced, stopped. The riverbed running through the heart of Isfahan beneath bridges that have stood for centuries is dry, cracked soil. The river's inflow is 6 cubic meters per second. The city's demand is 28 to 30 cubic meters per second. The mathematics are impossible before a single additional factor is introduced. But now, place all of this inside a military conflict. Because what the Iranian regime's generals are confronting with something approaching genuine horror is the realization that water is not merely a civilian problem, water is a military problem, a potentially decisive one. Iran maintains armed forces exceeding 500,000 personnel, 190,000 Revolutionary Guards, 350,000 regular army, up to 600,000 reserves on paper. A soldier in active combat conditions in a Middle Eastern climate requires between 15 and 20 liters of water per day. For hydration, for hygiene, critical to preventing battlefield disease, for cooking, for cooling vehicle and weapon systems, for medical care. 500,000 active military personnel in wartime conditions require tens of millions of liters of water every single day. In peacetime, this comes from barracks, wells, and city infrastructure. In wartime, when power plants are struck and pumps fail, when dams are at 1% and distribution networks have collapsed across multiple cities simultaneously, that water must come from tanker trucks, thousands of them, added to an already impossible logistical burden of moving ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment through a transport network being systematically dismantled from the air. The human body cannot sustain combat effectiveness without adequate water for more than a matter of hours. After 72 hours of true dehydration, kidneys fail, cognitive function collapses. A dehydrated pilot cannot fly. A dehydrated radar operator cannot track. A dehydrated infantry soldier cannot fight. Biological limits are not negotiable. They do not respond to ideology or revolutionary doctrine or 47 years of anti-American rhetoric. Reports from the front lines confirm what the water mathematics predicted. Some frontline units are being issued 20 rounds of ammunition for every 2 soldiers, 20 rounds, for 2 soldiers on the 12th day of active conflict. The logistical supply lines have been so thoroughly disrupted that field units in some regions are operating without reliable access to drinking water or sufficient food. No weapons, no water, no food. An army facing those conditions simultaneously cannot maintain loyalty, cohesion, or combat effectiveness. It cannot maintain anything. The collapse of Iran's military logistics was not accidental or improvised. It was the result of an operation that identified exactly where Iran's entire military architecture was most vulnerable and struck those points with surgical precision before Iran fully understood what was being dismantled. On the night of April 7th, U.S. and Israeli air forces conducted simultaneous precision strikes against 8 critical railway bridges across Iran's national rail network. Tehran to Karaj, Karaj to Tabriz, the Kashan Junction. The Calm Line running south to the ports and coastal defense positions protecting the Strait of Hormuz. 8 points selected from 11,000 kilometers of railway infrastructure, not randomly, but through 6 weeks of satellite surveillance, signals intelligence, and analysis of exactly which 8 points controlled the strategic function of the entire network. Iran's missile system had operated for 20 years on a 4-phase cycle. Disperse, hide, transport, launch. The railways were the circulatory system of that cycle. Moving missile components, solid fuel, engine parts, and technical personnel between dispersed underground depots and active launch positions. The entire elaborate architecture of Iran's nuclear deterrent capability depended on those rail connections functioning normally. Cut the railway at the right 8 points and the missiles stay in their depots. A missile that cannot move becomes a fixed coordinate. A fixed coordinate becomes a satellite-detected target. A detected target becomes the next airstrike. The day before the railway strikes, military transport aircraft and dozens of military helicopters had been destroyed. Air logistics cut first, then ground logistics. 2 legs of the supply chain disabled in consecutive operations. The IRGC's remaining transport option became highway truck convoys. The slowest vehicles, the most visible under continuous satellite surveillance. The most vulnerable to precision airstrikes moving along predictable routes between known origin points and known destinations. 2/3 of Iran's ballistic missile production capacity has been destroyed. The electronic defense hub in Tehran that produced missile guidance chips, drone navigation systems, and encrypted field communication networks was reduced to ash. The Shahab missile production complex in Qazvin was struck by JASSM stealth missiles launched from B-52s operating over 1,000 kilometers away. The F-14 fleet has been completely eliminated. Iran's own defense minister confirmed what the strike assessments showed. Air power was gone. The defense industry was 90% destroyed. Between March 13th and 16th, Iran's air defense systems were so thoroughly dismantled that the air raid sirens in Tehran stopped sounding. Not because the threat had passed, because there were no functioning radars left to detect incoming aircraft. And then Washington did something that did not require a single additional bomb. Something that may ultimately prove more destabilizing to what remains of Iran's command structure than any physical strike could achieve. Trump publicly acknowledged that the United States was dealing directly with Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf, a former IRGC Air Force commander, a man who fought in the Iran-Iraq War, who served as mayor of Tehran, who ran for the presidency 3 times, a child of the revolution from deep inside the system, not an externally imposed figure, but someone that the pragmatic military wing of the IRGC could theoretically work with as a future interlocutor. The moment Trump made that statement publicly, he did not need to fire another missile. He planted something inside the Iranian command structure that weapons cannot plant. Suspicion. Paralyzing, metastasizing, command-destroying suspicion. Because in the weeks before that statement, Iranian commanders had already been asking themselves the question that no military organization can survive asking. Someone is leaking our coordinates. The precision of American strikes against underground bunkers, concealed radar installations, and hidden command positions was too consistent to be coincidental. Targets that should have been unknown to any external actor were being struck with an accuracy that implied someone inside the system was providing the information. The precedent already existed. In 2023, IRGC intelligence officer Ali Nasiri had been arrested for collaborating with Western intelligence. That case had been directly connected to Israel's ability to conduct precision operations inside Tehran, including assassinations and the Natanz sabotage. The IRGC had launched a comprehensive internal investigation. Hundreds of security clearances were suspended. Numerous senior officers were removed from their positions. Now the suspicion was not about a mid-level intelligence officer. It was about the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, the regime's number 2. And there was no functioning supreme authority available to lead the investigation, because the supreme leader was in Moscow. Mojtaba Khamenei took over the supreme leadership following his father's death in March. He was wounded in airstrikes on Tehran. When Iranian medical facilities proved insufficient to treat those injuries, he was evacuated to Moscow on a Russian military plane at Putin's personal request. While Mojtaba lies in a Moscow hospital, the Iranian state is functionally split into 2 incompatible governments operating from the same capital. The civilian foreign ministry is signaling readiness for ceasefire talks. Foreign Minister Araghchi declared publicly that Iran welcomes any initiative to end the war, and that diplomatic relations with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and neighboring countries remained intact. Inside Iran, that statement detonated like a bomb. IRGC Commander Hussein Salami's inner circle responded immediately. Operations were continuing at full speed. A ceasefire could only be discussed after the enemy surrendered. Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf declared Iran was not seeking a ceasefire. The deputy foreign minister said there was no room for negotiation. senior official Mohsen Rezai announced the war would end only when the United States paid full compensation and completely withdrew from the Persian Gulf. The foreign minister says peace. The military says never. Two governments, one country. No supreme authority capable of resolving the contradiction. No mechanism to bring the civilian track and the military track into alignment. No one with the institutional authority to tell either side that it had to accept the other's position. The response of the state television was the most revealing signal of all. An emergency broadcast was transmitted calling regime supporters across the country to gather in the streets, demonstrate loyalty to security forces, and take a public oath of loyalty to the supreme leader. A loyalty oath, broadcast by a functioning state to its own soldiers and bureaucrats. A strong regime does not demand loyalty oaths from its own chain of command. Only a regime that no longer trusts its own chain of command reaches for that signal. Only a leadership that has lost confidence in the institutional loyalty of the structures. It depends on broadcasts that kind of appeal to its own apparatus. The message the regime was sending its own people was the most damning message it could have chosen. We are still here. And the fact that it needed to say that out loud was the most complete confirmation possible of just how uncertain that statement actually was. The paralysis that has resulted from this internal disintegration was already affecting military operations in ways that were becoming impossible to conceal from the outside world. IRGC speedboat commanders, who should have been operating in the Strait, were sitting in port calculating whether the officer who had given them their orders had already transmitted their coordinates to Washington before issuing those orders. Units that should have been reinforcing positions at Karg Island were not moving because the fear of internal betrayal had frozen the command mechanism from the inside. The IRGC was watching itself more carefully than it was watching the enemy. Its most dangerous adversary in the current moment was not the American carrier strike group circling in the Gulf. It was the uncertainty about which of its own commanders could be trusted. 3 scenarios now sit in front of the Iranian leadership, and none of them lead somewhere better than where Iran is today. In the first scenario, the IRGC seizes total control, purges the civilian government, and continues the war on a doctrine of pure militarist defiance. No supply lines, no functioning air defense, no reliable water, no allies providing meaningful material support. The soldiers are told to hold positions with 20 rounds each. The people in the cities are told to endure. The regime collapses inward faster than any external force could have forced it. In the second scenario, the civilian government forces a ceasefire on American terms. The nuclear program is dismantled. Iran withdraws from the Strait of Hormuz. Heavy compensation obligations are accepted. And the moment the agreement is signed, the IRGC turns its weapons on the government that signed it. The external war ends, and a civil war begins in the streets of the cities that just ran out of water. In the third scenario, neither side maintains control. The power vacuum at the top deepens beyond any possibility of managed resolution. The tension between the regular army and the IRGC escalates into open armed confrontation. Ethnic fault lines, suppressed for decades, activate simultaneously. Kurdish resistance movements in the northwest, Baluchi independence movements in the southeast, Ahwazi Arab mobilization in Khuzestan, a population of 88 million people, 60% of them under 30 years old, who have already staged the Green Movement, the 2019 gasoline protests, and the Mahsa Amini uprising, pouring into the streets the moment they perceive the security apparatus turning on itself instead of on them. Every one of these scenarios ends the same way, with an Iran that is no longer the regional power it spent 4 decades building, no longer the center of a resistance network extending to Hezbollah, to Yemen, to Iraqi militias, no longer the country that threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz and hold the world's energy supply hostage. The regime built its deterrence on missiles it can no longer produce, on proxies it can no longer supply, on a nuclear program buried under rubble, on a strait it can no longer threaten, on a population it can no longer feed or water. And the supreme leader who was supposed to hold all of it together is in a hospital in Moscow. Water riots had been warning the regime for years before any of this began. In Khuzestan province, years before this conflict, farmers blocked tankers, crowds attacked government buildings, and people stood in streets chanting a phrase the regime had no ideological answer for. We are thirsty. Those riots were not random social unrest. They were a preview, a warning that the IRGC's water mafia had been stealing from the people whose loyalty the regime depended on. A warning that the resistance economy doctrine sold to Iranians since 1979 was built on stolen water, depleted aquifers, and ecological destruction that no amount of revolutionary rhetoric could reverse. The regime refused to hear that warning. Hearing it would have meant confronting the IRGC's dam construction empire. It would have meant dismantling the economic networks that sustained the regime's own inner circle. It would have meant the regime dismantling itself. And so the warning was suppressed, the protesters were arrested, and the aquifers continued emptying. Now the dams are empty. The groundwater is gone. The rivers have stopped. The missiles cannot move because the railways that move them are cut at their 8 most critical junctions. The factories producing replacement weapons are rubble. The air defense network is so thoroughly dismantled that sirens in Tehran have gone silent. The chain of command is paralyzed by internal suspicion. The supreme leader is in a foreign hospital. The state is broadcasting loyalty oath demands to its own soldiers. And in the streets of Tehran, people are carrying empty plastic containers to water distribution points, running to reach the tanker before it empties. The question is no longer whether Iran can win this conflict. That question was answered weeks ago. The question that sits at the center of everything now is how many more days a regime can hold its structure together when its capital has no water, its army has no ammunition, its generals suspect each other of treason, its 2 governments are issuing contradictory orders to the same military, and the ideology it spent 47 years building cannot fill a single glass. The people carrying those containers through the streets of Tehran are not carrying them for the Islamic Republic. They are carrying them for their children. And the distance between those 2 things is the distance between a regime that survives and one that does not. This is Iran's worst fear. Not an aircraft carrier, not an airstrike, not any external adversary. The worst fear was always this moment, when the regime's own people look at empty taps and empty shelves and empty promises and calculate that what they are surviving is no longer worth surviving for the sake of the system that put them here. That moment has not fully arrived yet, but the people in the streets of Tehran are measuring the distance to it with every empty container they carry. And that distance is getting shorter every single day.